What if I told you that silence can change you in ways you don't even notice until something breaks it? Because for 10 years, my life had become so quiet that even the smallest sound felt out of place. Like I wasn't just living alone, I had become used to being invisible. And maybe you felt that too, that kind of loneliness that doesn't scream. It just settles in slowly, becoming your normal without asking permission. Because after a while, you stop expecting anything different, you stop checking your phone, you stop waiting for someone to visit, you stop imagining that something new might happen, and instead, you build a life around that silence. Routines that don't require anyone else, habits that don't depend on interruption, a version of yourself that feels safe because nothing unexpected ever happens, and that's exactly where I was, not unhappy exactly, but not alive either. Just existing in a space that felt the same every single day, waking up, moving through familiar rooms, doing things that had no surprises attached to them. And over time, you convince yourself that this is enough. That this is what life looks like now, that certain parts of your story are already finished, and maybe that's the hardest part, not the loneliness itself, but the acceptance of it. The quiet agreement you make with yourself that nothing is going to change, and I had made that agreement without even realizing it. Because when you live like that long enough, you stop asking questions like, what if? You stop imagining possibilities and you start living inside certainty, even if that certainty is empty. And that's why that night felt different before anything even happened. Because sometimes your instincts notice something before your mind does, like a shift you can't explain, a feeling that something is about to interrupt the pattern you've grown used to. And I remember it clearly, the way the house felt that evening. Not louder, not brighter, just different, like the silence itself was waiting, and I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing, just another night, just another routine. Just another moment that would pass exactly like all the others, but deep down something felt off. Something felt like the calm before something I couldn't name yet. And tell me if you've ever experienced that. That strange anticipation that shows up without reason, like your body is preparing for something your mind hasn't understood yet, because that's exactly how it felt, and I didn't know whether to dismiss it or pay attention to it. But before I could decide, it happened, a sound so simple that it shouldn't have mattered. But it did, because when you've lived in silence for 10 years, even the smallest interruption feels loud, and that knock, it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't repeated, it was just one simple knock, steady, clear, real, and for a second. I didn't move, I just stood there, trying to understand what I had just heard, because it didn't make sense, not in my world. Not in the life I had been living, because no one knocked anymore, no one came by unexpectedly, no one interrupted my routine. And yet, there it was again, another knock just as steady as the first, and suddenly, everything inside me reacted at once: curiosity, confusion, hesitation, and something else I hadn't felt in a long time: awareness, like my entire body had woken up in a way it hadn't for years, and I found myself standing there, asking questions I didn't have answers to. Who could it be? Why now? What do they want? And maybe those questions sound simple, but when your life has been as predictable as mine, they feel bigger, they feel heavier. They feel like they carry something more than just a visitor at your door. And for a moment, I considered ignoring it, pretending I hadn't heard it, going back to the quiet life I had built so carefully over the past 10 years. Because opening that door, it wasn't just opening a door, it was stepping into something unknown, something unpredictable, something that could change the pattern I had grown comfortable with, and comfort, even when it's empty, is hard to leave. And I stood there longer than I should have, thinking about all of that, about whether I should stay where I was or take a step forward, and that hesitation told me something important. I wasn't as unaffected as I thought I was. Because if it truly meant nothing, I wouldn't have needed to think about it, and that realization alone was enough to push me forward, because maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as done with life as I had convinced myself I was. And so I walked toward the door slowly, not out of excitement, not out of confidence, but out of something quieter, something closer to curiosity, and with each step I could feel that awareness growing stronger. That sense that something was about to happen that I hadn't planned for, something that didn't fit into the life I had been living. And when I finally reached the door, I paused again, my hand resting on the handle. Because in that moment, everything felt heavier than it should have, like this simple action carried more weight than opening a door normally would, and I didn't know why, I didn't know what I was expecting. But I knew one thing clearly: whatever was on the other side of that door, it didn't belong to the life I had been living for the past 10 years, and that thought alone was enough to make my heart beat just a little faster. Because sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that change everything, and without fully understanding why, I opened the door, and in that instant, I realized something I wasn't prepared for at all. What if I told you that sometimes the moment you open the door, you don't just see someone standing there, you feel something shift inside you before a single word is spoken? Because the second that door moved and the space between my quiet world and whatever was outside it disappeared, I realized this wasn't just another interruption. It was something I hadn't experienced in years. Something unfamiliar enough to make me pause even though I was already standing face to face with it. And there he was, not dramatic, not unusual in any obvious way, just my neighbor. Someone I had seen from a distance before but never really noticed, never really thought about, just another part of the background of a life I kept to myself. And yet, in that moment, he didn't feel like part of the background anymore. He felt present in a way that made everything else feel slightly distant, like the quiet routine I had been living had suddenly stepped back to make space for something new. And tell me if you've ever felt that. That strange awareness when someone who should feel ordinary suddenly doesn't, not because of what they say, not because of what they do, but because of how it feels to stand there in front of them, because that's what caught me off guard. Not his presence, but my reaction to it, because I wasn't used to reacting anymore. I wasn't used to feeling anything that disrupted my usual calm, and yet here I was, standing in a doorway, noticing things I hadn't noticed in a long time, the tone of his voice when he spoke, the way he hesitated slightly like he wasn't sure if he was interrupting something important. The way the moment stretched just enough to feel different from anything I had experienced in years, and his words were simple, nothing complicated, nothing that should have mattered beyond the surface, just a casual reason for being there. Something about needing help, something about checking in, something normal, and that's what made it even more confusing, because everything about the situation was normal except how it felt, and that difference stayed with me immediately. Because I realized something in that moment that I hadn't allowed myself to think about in a very long time. I was aware again, not just of what was happening, but of myself, of how I was responding, of how something as simple as a conversation at my door could feel significant, and I didn't know what to do with that, because when you've lived in silence for as long as I had, you don't just jump back into connection easily. You don't immediately understand what you're feeling, you question it, you analyze it, you try to make it fit into something familiar, and I found myself doing exactly that, trying to explain away something that didn't quite make sense. Telling myself it was just the unexpected nature of it, just the fact that I wasn't used to someone standing at my door, just a break in routine, nothing more. But even as I told myself that, something inside me didn't fully agree, something stayed unsettled, like a thought I couldn't finish. And as the conversation continued, as we stood there exchanging simple words that should have ended quickly, I noticed something else. I didn't want it to end as quickly as it normally would have, and that realization caught me off guard more than anything else, because for 10 years I had grown used to interactions being brief, minimal, necessary but not meaningful, and now there was this quiet hesitation, this subtle resistance to returning to the silence I had accepted as normal, and that feeling, it was unfamiliar enough to make me question everything about it. Because I didn't understand where it was coming from, why it was happening now, why something so small felt so different, and maybe you felt that too, that moment where something shifts inside you and you can't quite explain it. You just know that it's there, and ignoring it doesn't make it go away, it just makes it more noticeable, and that's exactly what happened, because the more I tried to treat it like nothing, the more it felt like something. Something I hadn't felt in a very long time, something I had convinced myself I didn't need anymore, and that realization, it made me slightly uncomfortable, not in a negative way, but in a way that challenged everything I had settled into over the past 10 years, because if this feeling was real, if this awareness meant something, then maybe the life I had accepted wasn't as complete as I thought it was. And that thought alone was enough to create a kind of tension inside me, because accepting that would mean accepting that I had been wrong about something, that I wasn't as finished with change as I had believed, and standing there, still in that doorway, still in that moment that had stretched longer than it should have, I found myself caught between two versions of myself, the one that had learned to live quietly, safely, predictably, and the one that was suddenly aware, suddenly present. Suddenly questioning whether that quiet life was really enough, and that conflict, it didn't resolve itself right away. It stayed there, lingering even after the conversation started to come to an end, because when he finally stepped back, when the reason for his visit was complete, when everything should have returned to normal, It didn't, not inside me, because even as the door closed, even as the silence returned, something had already changed, something I couldn't undo. Something I couldn't ignore, and I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, staring at a door that had just separated me from something I didn't fully understand yet, but knew was important. Because sometimes it's not the person who changes your life in an instant, it's the feeling they leave behind, the one that stays with you after they're gone, the one that makes you question everything you thought you had already accepted. And as I turned away from that door, as I stepped back into the same quiet house I had lived in for 10 years, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else. The silence didn't feel the same anymore. What if I told you that the hardest part isn't the moment something changes? It's what comes after, when you're left alone with a feeling you didn't expect, a feeling you don't fully understand, and a silence that suddenly feels different from the one you were used to, because that's exactly what happened to me after I closed that door, because nothing on the outside had changed, the same walls, the same furniture. The same quiet, but inside, something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore, like the life I had been living for 10 years had been gently disturbed, not broken, not replaced, just unsettled. And tell me if you've ever experienced that. That strange moment where everything looks the same, but feels completely different, like something invisible has moved and you can't quite put it back where it was, because that's how it felt. Like the silence I had grown comfortable with no longer fit the same way, like it had lost something I didn't even realize I needed until it was gone, and I tried to go back to my routine. I really did. I moved through the same steps, did the same things, told myself nothing had changed, that it was just a small interruption, just a moment that would pass like any other. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more present it became. Because when something inside you wakes up, even slightly, it doesn't go back to sleep just because you want it to, and that realization made everything more complicated than it should have been. Because now it wasn't just about a knock on the door, it wasn't just about a neighbor stopping by, it was about what that moment had triggered, what it had brought back to the surface without warning, and the more I thought about it, the more I noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to notice in years, like how quiet my evenings really were, how predictable my days had become, how little I expected from anything anymore. And those realizations, they didn't feel comfortable, they felt heavy, because once you become aware of something missing, it's hard to pretend it's not, and I found myself caught in that space, between what I had accepted and what I was starting to question, because for 10 years, I had built a life that didn't require anything from anyone else, a life that felt safe because it was controlled. Because nothing unexpected ever happened, but now something had happened, something small but enough to disrupt that balance, and I didn't know what to do with that, because when you've lived in a certain way for so long, change, even the smallest kind, feels bigger than it actually is, and I could feel that tension growing inside me, that quiet conflict between staying the same and allowing something new to exist. And that's when I started asking myself questions I hadn't asked in a very long time, questions like, why did that moment matter? Why am I still thinking about it? Why does this feel different from any other interaction I've had in years? And maybe you've asked yourself questions like that too, when something simple leaves a deeper impact than it should. And the truth is, those questions don't come with easy answers. They come with more awareness, more understanding, more realization of things you've been ignoring, and the more I sat with those thoughts, the clearer one thing became: I wasn't reacting to him, I was reacting to what that moment represented, something new, something unexpected, something that didn't fit into the quiet life I had accepted. And that realization was both unsettling and strangely comforting at the same time, because it meant I wasn't as disconnected as I thought I was. It meant there was still something inside me capable of responding, of feeling, of noticing. And that alone was enough to change how I saw everything, because for so long I had convinced myself that those parts of me were gone, that they belonged to a different time, a different version of my life, and now they were there again, not fully. Not strongly, but enough to be noticed, enough to make me pause, enough to make me question whether the life I had been living was truly complete. And that thought, it stayed with me long after that moment had passed. Because once you start questioning something you've accepted for years, it doesn't just disappear, it grows, it expands, it leads you to places you didn't expect, and I could feel that happening now, slowly, quietly. Like something inside me was beginning to open again, not all at once, not in a way I could control, but enough to make me aware that change had already started. And that awareness made everything feel uncertain in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time, because uncertainty means possibility, and possibility, it's both exciting and uncomfortable at the same time, especially when you've spent years avoiding it. And as I sat there, in that same house that had always felt so familiar, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. I didn't want things to go back to exactly the way they were, even though that's what I had been trying to convince myself of, because a part of me, a small but undeniable part, wanted to see what would happen next, wanted to understand why this moment felt different, wanted to explore something I had been avoiding without even realizing it. And that realization alone was enough to shift everything inside me, because it meant I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was becoming curious again. And curiosity is dangerous when you've built your life around certainty, because it pushes you forward, it makes you look for answers, it opens doors you might not be ready to walk through. And as I sat with that feeling, as I let it exist without trying to push it away this time, I understood something that felt both simple and overwhelming. This wasn't just about a knock on the door. This was about what happens when your life stops being completely predictable, and that unpredictability, it was just beginning. Because if one moment could change how everything felt, then what would happen if it happened again? What if I told you that once something inside you wakes up, even slightly, even quietly, life has a way of testing whether you'll ignore it or follow it? Because after that night, after everything I had felt but couldn't fully explain, I told myself it was over, that it was just a moment, just a small interruption that didn't mean anything more. And maybe you've done that too, tried to label something as insignificant just to keep your life from changing, just to return to what feels safe and predictable, because predictability, even when it's empty, feels easier than uncertainty. And for a while, I believed I could go back. I moved through the next day the same way I always did. The same routine, the same quiet, the same controlled rhythm that had defined my life for 10 years. But something was different now, not outside, but inside, because the awareness I had felt the night before didn't disappear, it stayed. Subtle but present, like a thought waiting to be acknowledged, like a question I hadn't answered yet, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more noticeable it became. Because once you feel something after a long time of feeling nothing, it doesn't fade easily, it lingers, it shifts your attention, it makes even the smallest details feel different. And I found myself noticing things I hadn't noticed before, like the way time passed slower when I was alone, like how quiet the house really was, like how I had stopped expecting anything new to happen. And that awareness, it wasn't comfortable, but it was real, and it made it harder to return to the version of myself that had accepted everything without question. And that's when it happened again, not exactly the same, not in the same way, but enough to make my heart react before my mind could catch up. Because later that day, as I was moving through what should have been another ordinary moment, there it was, another interruption. Another unexpected shift in the pattern I had grown used to, and for a second, I didn't believe it, because my life wasn't built for repetition like this. It wasn't built for surprises happening twice. It was built on silence, on routine, on the absence of anything new. And yet, there it was, standing right in front of me again. And this time, I didn't have the same hesitation. I didn't stand frozen questioning whether I should engage or not. Because something had already changed inside me, something that made me more aware, more present, more open than I had been before, and that difference, it mattered more than anything else. Because it meant I wasn't the same person I had been the night before, even if everything else looked the same. And as I found myself facing that moment again, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just coincidence. This wasn't just a random interaction happening twice. This was something else, something that was slowly pulling me out of the life I had been living. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but gently, persistently, like it was asking me a question without words, a question I hadn't answered yet. Would I stay where I was, or would I allow something new to exist? And that question, it felt heavier this time, because now I knew what it could lead to. Now I knew that even a small interaction could change how everything felt afterward, and maybe you felt that too. That moment where you realize that stepping forward means stepping into something unknown, something that could shift your entire perspective, and staying back means returning to something familiar but incomplete. And that choice, it's never as simple as it sounds, because both sides carry something, comfort on one side, possibility on the other. And standing there, caught between those two, I felt that same tension again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was awareness, because I understood what was happening. I understood that this wasn't just about a neighbor. This wasn't just about a conversation. This was about what those moments were doing to me. how they were slowly breaking the silence I had built around myself, how they were bringing back something I had buried without even realizing it. And that realization, it changed how I responded, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but internally because instead of resisting it, instead of trying to push it away, I allowed it to exist, just a little, just enough to see where it might lead. And that small shift, that willingness to not shut it down immediately, it changed everything because the moment you stop resisting something, it has space to grow. And as that moment unfolded, as the conversation happened again, as the silence around it felt different than before, I realized something I hadn't expected at all. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was anticipating. And anticipation, it means something has already begun. Something that doesn't end when the moment ends, something that stays with you, grows with you, changes how you see what comes next. And as that second moment came to a close, as everything returned to quiet once again, I didn't feel the same confusion I had felt before. I didn't feel the same need to explain it away, because now I understood one thing clearly. This wasn't over, not yet, because when something breaks a pattern once, it surprises you. But when it happens again, it starts to mean something, and that meaning, it was just beginning to reveal itself, because if two moments could change this much, then what would happen the next time? What if I told you that the most powerful changes don't happen all at once? They happen in patterns, quiet repetitions that slowly turn something unexpected into something you start to look for, even when you don't admit it to yourself. Because after that second moment, after I realized this wasn't just a one time interruption, something inside me shifted again, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Because now it wasn't just about reacting to what was happening, it was about what I was starting to expect. And that realization, it unsettled me more than anything else, because expectation means hope. And hope is dangerous when you've spent 10 years teaching yourself not to rely on anything changing. And maybe you felt that too, that quiet fear that comes with wanting something again, because wanting opens the door to disappointment. And disappointment is something you learn to avoid when your life has been built around silence and certainty. And for a moment, I tried to shut it down. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into something simple, that this would pass like everything else had passed. But the truth is, it didn't feel simple anymore because the pattern had already begun, and once something becomes a pattern, it's harder to dismiss, it's harder to ignore. It starts to take on meaning whether you want it to or not, and I could feel that meaning growing, not in what was happening on the surface, but in how it was affecting me, because I found myself noticing time differently now. Noticing when the day slowed down, when the evening approached, when the quiet settled in again. And with that awareness came something I hadn't felt in years: anticipation, subtle, quiet, but undeniable. And that feeling alone was enough to make me uncomfortable because I wasn't used to it. I didn't trust it. I didn't know where it was leading or what it meant. And yet, I couldn't push it away the way I used to push everything else away. Because this time it felt real, and that's when it happened again. Not exactly the same, not predictable, but enough to confirm what I was already starting to understand. Because when something happens 3 times, it stops being coincidence. It becomes something else, something intentional, something that carries weight whether you want it to or not. And as I found myself in that moment once again, facing something I hadn't planned for but was no longer completely surprised by, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't resisting anymore. I wasn't questioning whether I should engage or not. I wasn't trying to return to the life I had before. Because a part of me, a part I hadn't acknowledged until now, didn't want to go back to that life completely. And that realization, it was both freeing and terrifying at the same time because it meant I had crossed a line internally. A line between acceptance and possibility, between silence and something more. And once you cross that line, you can't go back to not knowing it exists. And I could feel that shift clearly now in the way I responded. In the way I allowed the moment to unfold without trying to control it, without trying to end it quickly, without trying to convince myself it didn't matter, because it did matter, not in a way I could fully explain yet, but in a way that was becoming more real with each repetition. And the more I allowed it, the more natural it started to feel, not forced, not uncomfortable, just different. Like I was slowly stepping into a version of my life that I hadn't experienced in a long time, a version that included something unexpected, something unpredictable, something that didn't fit into the quiet routine I had built. And that difference, it changed how everything felt afterward, because the silence that followed those moments no longer felt complete. It felt like something was missing, like the quiet wasn't enough on its own anymore. And that realization, it stayed with me longer each time, growing stronger, more present, more impossible to ignore, because now it wasn't just about the moments themselves. It was about what they were creating inside me. A kind of awareness, a kind of openness, a kind of curiosity that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. And that curiosity, it's powerful because it doesn't just stay contained, it expands, it asks questions. It pushes you forward whether you're ready or not, and I could feel it doing exactly that because now I wasn't just experiencing these moments. I was starting to think about what they meant, where they were leading, what would happen next. And that next, it became something I couldn't stop thinking about because for the first time in 10 years, my life didn't feel completely predictable anymore, and unpredictability, it changes everything. Because it brings possibility back into a space where it didn't exist before, and standing there, in the middle of that realization, I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit until now. This wasn't just about someone knocking on my door. This was about what happens when your life starts opening up again, slowly, quietly, without permission. And that opening, it was no longer something I could close as easily as before, because a part of me didn't want to close it anymore. A part of me wanted to see where it would go, what it would become, what it would reveal about a life I thought had already settled into its final form, and that thought alone, it changed everything. Because it meant one thing clearly, this wasn't just a moment anymore. This was the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet, and the most unsettling part was, I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. What if I told you that the moment you stop trying to go back to the way things were is the moment everything truly begins to change? Because after that point, after I realized I wasn't resisting anymore, something inside me settled in a way I hadn't expected, not into certainty, not into comfort, but into acceptance. A quiet acceptance that whatever this was, it wasn't going away, and more importantly, I didn't want it to. And maybe you felt that too, that shift where something that once felt unfamiliar starts to feel natural, not because you fully understand it, but because you've allowed it to exist long enough for it to become part of your reality. And that's exactly what was happening to me, because now it wasn't just about the moments themselves, it was about how they were changing me, how they were slowly reshaping the way I experienced my own life, because for 10 years, everything had been predictable, controlled, untouched by anything unexpected. And now that control had been gently disrupted, replaced by something else entirely, possibility, and possibility, it changes how you see everything. Because once you realize that your life isn't as fixed as you thought it was, you start looking at things differently. You start noticing details you used to ignore. You start feeling things you thought were gone, and that awareness, it spreads. It reaches into parts of your life that haven't changed yet and quietly asks, what about this? What about this part? What about the things you've accepted without question? And I could feel that happening now, not just in those moments, but in everything around them, in the way my days felt less empty, in the way my thoughts lingered on something other than routine, in the way I started to recognize that the life I had built, while safe, wasn't complete. And that realization didn't feel like regret. It felt like awakening, like something inside me had been waiting for the right moment to come back, and now that it had, it wasn't going to disappear again. And as I allowed myself to move forward with that awareness, as I stopped trying to control what this meant or where it was going, something else became clear. This wasn't just happening to me, I was choosing to let it happen. And that choice, it's important because it means I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was participating. I was stepping into something instead of standing at the edge of it, and that shift changes everything because when you choose something, even quietly, even without fully understanding it, you become part of it, and I could feel that connection growing now, not rushed, not forced, but steady, like something that was finding its place in my life naturally, without needing to be explained or defined, and the more I allowed it, the more comfortable it became, not in the sense of familiarity, but in the sense of alignment, like it belonged there even if it hadn't always been there. And that feeling, it's rare, especially when you've spent years living in a way that doesn't challenge you, doesn't surprise you, doesn't ask anything new of you, and now, everything felt just slightly different. Just enough to remind me that something had changed, something I couldn't undo even if I wanted to, and that realization didn't scare me the way it might have before. Because I understood now that this wasn't about losing control, it was about experiencing something I had been missing, something I hadn't even realized I needed until it was right in front of me, and as I stood in that space, between what my life had been and what it was slowly becoming, I realized something that felt both simple and profound. I wasn't the same person who had opened that door the first time, because that version of me had been closed, predictable, certain in a way that left no room for change, and now I was different, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to see possibilities where I hadn't seen them before, enough to feel something where I had felt nothing for so long. And that difference, it was growing quietly but steadily, shaping the way I thought, the way I felt, the way I moved through each day. And I could sense that something more was coming, not in a way I could predict, not in a way I could control, but in a way that felt inevitable, because when something begins to unfold like this, it doesn't stop halfway, it continues, it deepens, it leads somewhere, and standing there in that awareness, I couldn't help but ask myself a question I hadn't asked in years. What if this isn't just a moment? What if this is the start of something I was never expecting? Something that doesn't fit into the life I had planned, but changes it completely. And that question, it stayed with me, stronger than anything before it. Because for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't just living my life, I was waiting to see what would happen next. What if I told you that sometimes the most life changing moments don't arrive as something big and obvious? They arrive quietly, through small, repeated interruptions that slowly turn into something you can't ignore anymore. Because by the time I reached that point, after everything had shifted inside me, after I had stopped resisting and started allowing, I realized something that felt both simple and overwhelming at the same time. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't just a series of moments that would fade away and leave my life exactly the way it was before. This was something else entirely, something that had already changed me in ways I couldn't reverse, and maybe you felt that too. That realization that something has crossed a line inside you, a line between who you were and who you're becoming, and once you cross it, you can't go back to not knowing, not feeling, not seeing what you see now. Because that's exactly where I found myself, standing in a life that looked the same on the outside, but felt completely different on the inside, because the silence that once defined everything no longer held the same weight. It no longer felt complete on its own. It felt like something that had been interrupted in a way that couldn't be undone, and that interruption, it had become part of me, part of how I experienced each day, part of how I thought about what could happen next, and that next, it became something I couldn't ignore anymore, not because I was forcing it, but because it was naturally there, growing, unfolding, becoming more real with each passing moment. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood until now. I wasn't just waiting for something to happen anymore, I was open to it. And that openness, it changes everything. Because when you're open, you stop closing doors before they even have a chance to open. You stop protecting yourself from possibilities that might actually bring something meaningful into your life. And for 10 years, I had been closed without realizing it, not intentionally, not consciously, but in a way that kept everything safe, predictable, untouched by anything that could disrupt it. And now that had changed completely because I had allowed something in. Something small at first, something I didn't fully understand, but something that had grown into something undeniable, and that realization brought me to a moment I couldn't avoid anymore. A moment where I had to decide what this actually meant for me, not for anyone else, not in terms of labels or explanations, but in terms of how I wanted to live moving forward, because this wasn't just about a neighbor. This wasn't just about a knock on the door. This was about what happens when your life opens up again after you've spent years believing it wouldn't. And that kind of opening, it asks something from you. It asks you to step forward, to accept change, to allow something new to exist even if it doesn't fit into the life you thought you would have. And standing there in that awareness, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. Not in the way I had been at the beginning, not in the way that made me hesitate or question whether I should engage or not. Because now I understood that what I was feeling wasn't something I needed to control, it was something I needed to experience, something I needed to let unfold naturally, because life doesn't always follow the timeline you expect. It doesn't always wait until you're ready, it doesn't always make sense in a way that fits into your plans, sometimes. It just happens quietly, unexpectedly, and it's up to you to decide whether you close the door on it or step into it. And for the first time in 10 years, I chose to step forward, not with certainty, not with a clear understanding of where this would lead, but with something much more important, willingness, because willingness is what allows life to change. It's what turns moments into meaning. It's what transforms something small into something that can reshape everything. And as I stood there, no longer trying to return to the past, no longer trying to protect myself from what I was feeling, I understood one thing with complete clarity. I wasn't alone in the way I thought I was anymore. not just because someone had knocked on my door, but because something inside me had opened, something that allowed connection, possibility, and feeling to exist again. And that realization, it didn't just change that moment, it changed everything that would come after it. Because once you allow yourself to feel again, life doesn't go back to silence the same way. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves you with, the one I didn't ask myself until everything had already changed. If something unexpected knocked on the door of your life after years of silence, would you open it? Or would you stay inside the comfort of what you already know, even if it means never finding out what could have changed everything?